Forget New York. Forget Washington, D.C. For nearly 2 decades in the Gilded Age, the true financial and political capital of the United States was a city you've likely never heard of, Anaconda, Montana. This city, built on a mountain of copper, was ruled by a single, ruthless corporation whose money bought governors, corrupted the U.S. Senate, and sparked a legal war that literally shut down the entire court system of a state. This is the astonishing, true story of how a single company town held the nation's electrical future hostage, and then vanished like a mirage.
The air tasted like pennies and burnt sulfur. If you stood atop the desolate ridge in Montana Territory in the autumn of 1883 and looked down, you wouldn't see a town, you would see the future. And you would see one man's absolute, uncompromising will forged in brick and steel. That man was Marcus Daly, an Irish immigrant with the eyes of a visionary and the hands of a brawler. He didn't just stumble upon a copper deposit. He found the raw, untamed heart of America's industrial revolution, buried deep beneath a hill 80 miles away in Butte. But Butte was too wild, too chaotic. Daly needed a kingdom, a perfect machine to process the wealth of the richest hill on earth. He chose this valley, a pristine, wind-swept meadow where the Deer Lodge River ran cold and clear, and he named his creation Anaconda. This wasn't some haphazard mining camp. This was a planned city, Daly's model of what American industrial life should be. A central plaza, tree-lined streets, brick sidewalks, and gas lamps ordered like soldiers on parade. It felt less like the American West and more like a fever dream of a European capital suddenly dropped onto the frontier. But the true, terrifying scale of his ambition was the centerpiece. It was the Anaconda Copper Smelter. The stack stood 585 feet. To an American audience accustomed to the vertical ambition of New York City, this number needs context. In 1883, there were almost no man-made structures taller than this stack in the entire United States. It dominated the sky, a towering monument that swallowed the clouds and spewed forth a plume of smoke so massive, so enduring, that sailors on the Great Lakes swore they could tell the weather by the distant haze it created. This was the engine of Anaconda, and Anaconda was about to become the true shadow capital of the United States. The gold rush is dead. Long live the copper rush. Gold was frivolous, silver was unstable, but copper, by the 1880s, was destiny. Thomas Edison had just thrown the switch on the world's first central power station. Alexander Graham Bell's telephone was connecting a continent. Every spark, every light bulb, every message sent across the rapidly wiring nation needed copper. A vast, insatiable demand, a thirst that only the copper mines of Montana could quench. Daly, the king of this resource, didn't think in terms of tons. He thought in terms of control. His power emanated from the smelter's furnaces. The roar was constant. A seismic pulse felt 20 miles away. Inside the massive brick sheds, men toiled in an inferno, pouring molten metal that flowed like liquid fire into molds. "If the nation runs on electricity," Daly often said, his accent still thick with the old country, "then Montana holds the battery." He didn't just control the metal, he controlled the men. In Anaconda, there was only one employer, the Anaconda Copper Mining Company, ACM. They owned the houses, the grocery stores, the local bank, the waterworks, and even the spectacular 3-story opera house where Daly entertained visiting dignitaries from New York and London. This level of corporate control was unprecedented. If you lived in Anaconda, your life, from the moment you woke until the day you were buried, was an ACM product. This was the dark reality beneath the polished streets. The town was not built on democracy. It was built on absolute corporate feudalism. The rival and the gathering storm. Every king needs a rival, and Daly had one who was richer, more ruthless, and infinitely more vain. William A. Clark. Clark, operating out of the rough-and-tumble boomtown of Butte, saw Daly's ambition and sneered. While Daly focused on building a beautiful, ordered city, Clark focused on one thing: power, regardless of the cost. Where Daly was a shrewd industrialist, Clark was a collector of titles. He craved the prestige of the East Coast elite, who considered him a Western robber baron, nothing more than a crude provincial. Clark's hunger was not for copper, but for the ultimate symbol of national acceptance, a seat in the United States Senate. The simmering rivalry between the two copper kings was about to boil over, not in the mines, but in the political arena. The immediate prize? The permanent capital of the newly minted state of Montana. In 1894, the battle lines were drawn. Helena, Clark's adopted city, old money, traditional. Anaconda, Daly's personal, company-owned kingdom. Daly believed that if Anaconda became the capital, the ACM's dominance would be absolute, untouchable. He poured fortunes into the fight. He bought up every available newspaper, transforming the Anaconda Standard into the most aggressive propaganda machine in the West. He imported voters by the trainload, offering free lodging and meals. The result was a campaign so brazenly corrupt, so awash in bribes and corporate money, that it set a new, appalling standard for American democracy. It was not an election. It was a hostile corporate takeover of a state's very identity. The stakes were not just brick and mortar. The stakes were the soul of Montana. And the victor would control not just a town, but the levers of power that ran all the way to Washington, D.C.
The year 1894 was supposed to be about choosing a capital city. For Marcus Daly, it was about proving his ultimate control. For William A. Clark, it was about humiliating his rival. The campaign was less an exercise in democracy and more an open-air auction. Daly, fighting for Anaconda, and Clark, backing Helena, poured fortunes into the state. They didn't just spend money, they redefined its very purpose. Newspapers, Daly's Anaconda Standard and Clark's Helena Independent, became pure propaganda sheets. Reporters were paid to print outright fabrications. One issue might claim Helena's water supply was poisoned, while the next would accuse Daly of importing criminals. The voters, trainloads of men, many of whom had never lived in Montana, were shipped into the key counties and given temporary lodgings, whiskey, and cash in exchange for a promise to vote for the city their king supported. The bribes, cash payoffs were brazenly handed out on street corners. The going rate for a poor worker's vote often exceeded his entire month's wages. When the ballots were finally tallied, Helena won, a bitter and expensive defeat for Daly, who instantly knew he had been outspent and outmaneuvered by Clark's sheer determination to win at any cost. The loss did not break Daly, it focused him. He realized that the fight over a city was trivial compared to the fight over Washington, D.C. The war for copper was about to move from the wild mining camps to the hallowed halls of the U.S. Congress. The ultimate prize, the Senate seat, 1899 to 1900. In the Gilded Age, U.S. senators were not elected by popular vote. They were chosen by the state's legislative assembly. This archaic rule provided the perfect choke point for corporate control. If you could buy enough state legislators, you could buy a Senate seat, and William A. Clark was determined to buy one. Clark had two goals: to wear the title of senator and to gain immunity from the growing number of federal lawsuits challenging his vast land and mining claims. In the winter of 1899, as the Montana legislature convened, the spectacle began. Legislators were kidnapped, plied with liquor, and offered sums of money that stunned even the cynical observers of the Gilded Age. The most famous and astonishing incident involved the testimony of Representative Frederick Shardikov. He openly admitted that agents of William A. Clark had handed him $10,000 in gold certificates as a down payment for his vote, with the promise of more if Clark was successfully seated. But Clark's agents were not subtle. One legislator, being wooed by Clark's men, reported that the bribes were so overt, the cash piled so high, that he felt sickened by the crude display of wealth. Clark reportedly spent over $431,000, a sum equivalent to many millions today, securing his position. Despite the widespread rumors, the Montana Assembly, controlled by Clark's money, elected him to the Senate. The U.S. Senate investigation, a nation stunned. Clark's triumph was short-lived. The sheer appalling scale of the corruption was too great to ignore. Even in an era rife with political scandal, Montana's legislative circus made national headlines. The U.S. Senate, deeply embarrassed, launched a full-scale investigation into Clark's election. The testimony was explosive. Witnesses detailed trunkloads of cash, whispered deals in hotel rooms, and the complete moral collapse of the state government. The investigation revealed that the Copper King had not just bribed a few men, he had treated the entire state legislature like a commodity to be purchased. The committee, led by Senator George F. Hoare of Massachusetts, concluded that Clark was unfit to sit in the Senate due to his corrupt and criminal practices. Faced with certain expulsion, William A. Clark executed a brilliant, cynical maneuver. He resigned. He didn't wait for the Senate to kick him out. He stripped them of the power to do so. A short time later, using a political loophole, Clark simply ran again and, still flush with copper wealth, was elected once more, this time by a legitimate, though heavily influenced, state vote. The lesson was brutal and clear to the American public. Wealth was power, and in the Gilded Age, wealth could trump every law, every ethical standard, and even the judgment of the United States Senate. Montana was now branded forever as the company state. But the Copper King's ultimate fall down wouldn't come from Washington, D.C., or even from their rivals. It would come from a young, brilliant wildcat engineer who knew how to use one thing they had forgotten: the fine print of the law.
By 1900, the Anaconda Copper Mining Company, ACM, now partially controlled by the ailing Marcus Daly, had achieved total dominance. They had survived the Capitol War and the Senate scandal. They believed their mountain of wealth made them immune to any challenge. Then came Frederick Augustus Hines. Hines was different from the older generation of Copper Kings. He wasn't an immigrant brawler or a vain politician. He was a refined, brilliant mining engineer trained at prestigious German and American universities. He was sharp, charming, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of American mining law, especially the infamous Apex Law of 1872. The Apex Law stipulated that if a miner discovered the apex, the highest point, of a mineral vein on his property, he had the right to follow that vein wherever it dipped or slanted, even if it went deep beneath a neighbor's property line. This law was a disaster for legal clarity, designed for the rough-and-tumble gold rush. Hines saw it as a blueprint for legalized theft. He bought up tiny, strategically placed mining claims in Butte, mere specks of land adjacent to the vast Anaconda holdings. Using the Apex Law, he argued that the rich copper veins being mined deep beneath ACM's ground actually originated on his small, worthless claims. The fight wasn't about copper. It was about paperwork. The legal anarchy, mining by injunction. Hines's strategy was pure genius and pure anarchy. He didn't use dynamite. He used court orders. The injunction barrage. Hines would file a lawsuit claiming apex rights over a rich ACM shaft. When the local judge, who was often on his payroll, just as the kings had judges on theirs, ruled in his favor, he would obtain an injunction. The shocking result: an injunction is a court order demanding an immediate halt to mining. Overnight, Hines could shut down one of Anaconda's richest shafts. The moment ACM managed to get one injunction overturned, Hines would file 10 more, targeting different parts of the same mine. The entire city of Butte became a battleground of writs and summonses. Miners would report to work only to find a sheriff standing guard, holding a court order demanding they stop digging. ACM, in turn, filed counter-injunctions against Hines, leading to a ridiculous situation: 2 opposing court orders applying to the same vein of copper. The courts, overwhelmed and completely compromised, simply fractured. The Montana court collapse, 1901 to 1903. The situation escalated to the point where the entire Montana court system effectively seized up. Paralysis, judges refused to rule, fearing the wrath of the Copper Kings or Hines. No one knew whose injunction was legally valid. The conflict was so intense and the dollar amount so high that the credibility of every judge, every lawyer, and every decision was called into question. This was the ultimate exposure of the Gilded Age's central flaw. When corporate wealth controls the government, even the bedrock of democracy, the impartial judiciary, can be bought, paralyzed, and destroyed. Hines, the brilliant wildcat, had successfully destabilized a corporate empire using nothing but legal paperwork and sheer nerve. He had created millions in damage, forced mine shutdowns, and threatened the copper supply for the entire nation's electrical infrastructure. The older established powers of the East, the trusts and bankers of Wall Street, looked on in horror. This chaotic, unpredictable legal warfare was bad for business. They saw that the local, personal rule of the Copper Kings was simply too messy, too vulnerable to wildcards like Hines.
Trust arrives. From Kings to Corporation, 1906. The legal anarchy created by Hines was the final straw. For the powerful financial interests of the East Coast, men like J.P. Morgan and the shadowy figures behind the Amalgamated Copper Company, a trust known infamously as the Copper Trust, the predictable Montana wars were a dangerous liability. The copper supply, vital for America's burgeoning electrical age, could not be held hostage by legal squabbles in a Western territory. They decided to clean house. The Amalgamated Copper Company, headquartered in New York City, systematically moved to buy out all the principal players. Buying the wild card, Frederick Hines, the legal genius who brought the courts to their knees, was paid a staggering $12 million to sell his holdings and agreed to leave Montana. The wildcat engineer was tamed with cash. Buying the empire, the core Anaconda Copper Mining Company, along with the vast assets of Clark and others, was consolidated under the sole control of Amalgamated, which soon merged directly into ACM. The transition was immediate and devastating to the state's identity. Marcus Daly had died in 1900, but his vision died in 1906. Power shifted 2,000 miles east. Decisions regarding layoffs, mine safety, wages, and political appointments were no longer made in the offices of Butte or Anaconda. They were made on Wall Street. Montana had gone from being the company state, ruled by local tyrants, to being the colony state, ruled by absentee landlords. The town of Anaconda, built with such ambition and pride, instantly lost its political importance and its soul. It became a shadow capital, a place where the machinery worked, but the power center was elsewhere. The final legacy: silence and smoke. The ACM continued to operate the massive smelter complex for decades, churning out copper for 2 world wars and the electronic age. But the political battles were over. The energy, the astonishing corruption, the intense drama of the Copper Kings era was replaced by the cold efficiency of the corporation. The town of Anaconda never recovered its political prestige. Then, in the 1970s, as environmental regulations tightened and the quality of the ore declined, the inevitable occurred. The Anaconda Smelter, the industrial heart that had beaten for nearly a century, was scheduled for closure. In 1980, the smelter shut down for the last time. The immense, sprawling complex was dismantled, leaving behind only foundations, ghosts, and the polluted scars of its colossal operation. Standing 585 feet tall, it is one of the tallest brick structures in the world. It is a monument to an era when American capitalism was raw, unchecked, and violently ambitious. It stands as a perpetual reminder of the astonishment of Gilded Age scale, the engineering feat required to build such a structure for a single company in a remote location, the cost of corporate power, the environmental degradation, and the absolute corruption of democracy that copper wealth financed. The vanishing city, the tale of a town built to be a capital, the true seat of American electrical power, that was abandoned by the very forces it helped to create. The stack no longer belches smoke over the horizon. It stands in silence, a towering eulogy to the ambition, greed, and ultimate fall of the Copper Kings, and a constant historical warning about what happens when corporate power eclipses the rule of law. The shadow capital is gone, but the shadow it cast over American history remains.